Hey, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jason Trask. I'm a Strategic Communication Associate with the Justice Information and Resource Network. We'd like to thank the Bureau of Justice Statistics for their support in helping us deliver these webinars. We're excited to have you here. Power BI is a powerful tool for transforming raw data into meaningful insights and interactive dashboards. Today, we will focus on the basics of Power BI, explore its key features, and demonstrate how to connect different data sources. Today's training will be led by Charlie Gibberti. Charlie is a solution engineer contracting with the Department of Justice's Money Laundering and Asset Recovery section to implement next-generation data analysis systems. Throughout his private sector career, he has consulted with the Department of Defense, the Department of Labor, and public and private sector agencies in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. He provides training and technical assistance to state and local law enforcement through Project Safe Neighborhoods and the Crime Analyst in Residence program. Charlie has worked as a crime analyst for the Cincinnati Police Department and as an analyst supervisor for the Wichita Police Department before entering the private sector. Just a note before we get started, please feel free to contact me if you have any interest in learning more about our upcoming courses or to suggest topics for future webinars. Jern is here to help the SACs by facilitating TTA and connecting you with experts who can assist with your projects. With that being said, Charlie, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Charlie. As you can see, I've got a Canva presentation here that I'm going to run through, but I want to just assure everybody we're doing like 3 slides on this presentation and then we're getting hands-on. So this is going to be a really hands-on class. This is the first of 4. So we have another one scheduled next week and then 2 more in January where we're going to get into slightly more advanced topics, but this is starting from absolute zero. So if you've never worked with Power BI before and it all looks kind of intimidating, don't worry, you're in the right place. To follow along, you're going to need a couple of things. So first of all, you can access all of the course files we're going to use at tinyurl.com/journpowerbi. And then if you want to access this slide presentation, you can hit the QR code there on the left with your phone, or you can go to tinyurl.com/journslides and it'll bring you here. Now, this slide presentation is like 100 slides long. We're only showing 4, I promise. But the reason it's so long is because we've embedded video walkthroughs for each of the things that we're going to cover over the course of these 4 classes here. So this is a really great reference material. So if you're ever thinking like, how do we do that thing that we did that one day where we made the measure point to this other thing over here? Chances are that there's probably a video walkthrough recorded somewhere in this Canva presentation that shows you how we do a lot of these things. So you can always refer back to it later. I do also want to give credit where credit is due. I didn't create this presentation all by myself. I had, in fact, quite a bit of help from my partner, Amanda Bruner, who works with me as part of the CAR program at CNA. My name is Charlie Gibberti. That's me on the left. If you'd like to connect with either of us on LinkedIn, you're more than welcome to hit those QR codes in the corners of the screen there, and we're happy to connect with you and answer any follow-up questions that you might have. So getting started, you're going to need those files. Should have been an email that went out yesterday, gave you an opportunity to download those. But again, if you weren't able to get those, you can get them at tinyurl.com/journpowerbi. And it will take you to a Google Drive. There's just one folder in it. You can download the entire folder. I'll do that in just a second. Some other things that you might need, if you do not already have Power BI downloaded, you'll need to download it from the Microsoft Store. Keep in mind, Power BI will not work on a Mac. So if you're on a Mac, switch over to your Windows PC and download it there. You may also want to create a ChatGPT account. So not in this session, but when we get down the road and we get into slightly more complex topics like writing statements and DAX statements and measures and things like that, I like to teach, instead of learning how every individual formula works and then learning how to nest formulas inside each other and basically learning how to code, I like to teach students just how to prompt ChatGPT to give you that code. And so, and I remember back in the day, I used to have like a book full of Excel formulas. That used to be the way to do it. That's really a waste of time now. You can do really advanced DAX statements without actually sitting down and learning much about DAX, so long as you've got a ChatGPT account. None of the things that we talk about in here involve uploading any sort of data into ChatGPT, or personally identifying information, or using it in any way where any sort of inherent bias might affect your results, just in case anybody's agencies are particularly concerned about that. And then in addition, you may also want to download the Power BI mobile app on your phone. So probably the end of session 2, we'll talk about sharing dashboards out in a mobile view. And that's a really cool feature, especially if you're advising somebody like an executive, like how many, who are asking questions about crime and patterns and trends. If they, ask a question on the spot, man, I wonder, what are our robbery trends doing, or what neighborhood is the biggest problem, or what area of the state, or whatever. It's really cool to just be able to whip out your phone and access your dashboard and have an answer right on the spot. So I will do a real quick review of that probably towards the end of our second session. And then for anybody who wants to go a little bit more in depth, I do have a Udemy course. It's all self-paced. It's called Power BI for Crime Analysts. It's going to review some of the concepts that we talk about in this class together. It does go a little bit deeper at certain points. And you can also use the discount code JERNPowerBI. Anyone who's in this class gets $5 off, so it's only $19.99. All right. So unless there is somebody who's really struggling to access those files, I am going to go ahead and switch over and start getting hands-on. Is anybody having trouble accessing any of our course material? I'm not seeing any raised hands, so I guess we're good. Oh, hold on. So we did have some who weren't able to access the files, but they put links to them in the chat. Are you able to download this directly from the chat? They are. That's awesome. Okay, so if you're having trouble accessing that Google Drive, if you look in the chat, you can download each one of those one at a time. For starters, the files that we're going to need to start off with are the dashboard called IACA 2024, and then the other Excel file is RMS offenses. So if you have to download those one at a time, I would just download those first 2, and then just have the other ones ready for our next class. So when you download this file, you should have a Power BI file in here. It's called IACA 2024 because I created this initially for the IACA conference in Las Vegas this past year. If you open that up, this is a sort of a template that we're going to follow. This is a completed project that we're going to stitch together step by step throughout the course. So we're not going to start from here. We're going to start from a blank Power BI instance. But this is a really great opportunity to kind of see where we're going with the dashboard. So if we open this up, you're going to see the layout for this is somewhat similar to Microsoft Excel in that there are tabs along the bottom that will lead you to different workbooks. If you click on this first one that's called Offenses, this is what I refer to as a basic dashboard. And it's not necessarily basic because the visualizations are basic. It's basic because this is only feeding off of one table of data. If you go over to the Offenses plus CAD tab, that's going to give you a slightly more advanced dashboard. And again, the visualizations don't necessarily look that much more advanced. What's advanced about this is not necessarily what you're seeing here. It's the data model that rests underneath this and how you have to stitch multiple tables of data together to create a dashboard that can look at not just offense data, but also CAD data at the same time. And so that's whenever I talk about basic versus advanced dashboards, that's kind of the difference. And then there is also this offender workup dashboard. We're probably not going to get to this over the course of our classes, but it's definitely there. This is if you want to learn from it. This is slightly more advanced. Again, not because the visualizations are advanced, but because of the architecture that you have to put underneath is a little bit more difficult. If you are viewing this first dashboard and there is not a map showing up and it's saying something about you don't have permissions and your administrator hasn't enabled mapping, something like that, there's probably like a little green X there. There's a couple things that you can do. The first thing that you can do is look up here in the top right. And you'll notice how mine says sign in. This means that I'm not signed into a Microsoft account. If your Power BI displays a name up in the top right, that means that you're signed into a Microsoft account and your organization has certain policies in place, like whether or not you can make maps. And so something that you can do throughout the course is you can just log out and work as a guest, and those maps should work. And then as we get into mapping, if those issues continue, I'm going to take you through a little troubleshooting section to how you can enable those permissions as well. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind as we go forward. And then there are some other things in here, some other advanced features on these other tabs that we'll come back to a little bit later and why those kind of look a little different. All right, so to start building this out, I'm going to minimize this and I might refer back to it every now and then just to kind of keep us on track. We're going to focus on building out a dashboard that looks like this first page. And on today's class, we're going to focus on these cards over here on the left that display some counts, these slicers over here on the right that allow you to adjust certain values like date ranges or picking the reporting officer. We're also going to do some simple graphs like bar charts and line graphs, and then also some maps. We might get into these guys down here, but these are a little bit more advanced, so those might push to our second. So to get started, I'm going to minimize this, and I'm just going to open up a brand new instance of Power BI. All right, so there is a little piece of nomenclature here that I want to clear up. Whenever you open Power BI for the first time, you're going to land on a screen that looks kind of like this. And ultimately, we're going to start by clicking on this button that says blank report in the top left. Now, when I refer to the product that we are building here, I almost always refer to that as a dashboard. And a dashboard to me is something dynamic that you can interact with. You can adjust slicers, you can pick a certain neighborhood and filter everything down on it, versus a report in my language is something that's static. So if you print out something on PDF and you hand it in, that's a report. In Power BI, the nomenclature is a little different. So we're going to click on build a blank report, but this is going to take us to the dashboard building interface. And I just wanted to clarify that as we get started. Whenever you come here, there's actually 4 different views. This first page is what we call the report page. And if you want to see what these are called, if you hover over here to the left-hand toolbar, you'll notice there's a green line here indicating that this is the page that we're on. This is the report view. If you come down here and hover over this next icon, you can see that that's the table view. Below that is the model view. And the 4th one is the DAX query. So this is where the report page is where we're actually going to build visualizations. And we're going to go ahead and get started by ingesting a set of data. So like I said from the beginning, that first Excel file called RMS offenses is what we're going to start working with. And our first dashboard is just going to look at one set of data. And so this structure of data I've simulated to be very much like what I see on a lot of the dashboards that other statistical analysis centers have published. A lot of them are offense data taken from police record management systems, or at least aggregated from there, and the structure should be very similar. So to get started, I'm going to go up here to Get Data, and then I'm going to hit Excel Workbook. It's going to bring up this little navigation screen, and I'm just going to navigate to wherever you downloaded that folder. So mine is on my desktop. Here's the folder, BD Power BI 2012-2024. And I'm going to click on RMS offenses. Now, when you do this for any data source, it's going to bring up a little ingestion screen. So here is our navigator. What this is telling me is that in the RMS offenses Excel file, there's one tab, and that tab is labeled data. So if you click on that, it's going to show you the table. And you can actually look and you can see some of the data values there. So you can see we've got an offense number. It's a unique number for every particular offense. We've got the date that it occurred, the NIBRS code, whether or not the victim was injured. We've got some Latin long. And if you're doing mapping and you've got really clean Latin long data, that's a jackpot. But we've also got address and city and zip code information. If you don't have Latin long, but you do have good addresses, we'll talk about how to make maps with those. And then we've also got the reporting officer, the report number, and then some narrative information as well. So I'm going to go ahead and hit load at this point and pull this into the dashboard. But I do just want to point out before I do that, that you can also hit this transform data button. And for any of you who are really advanced with Excel, this should look familiar. So this is Power Query Editor. There are a lot of different things that you can do from inside Power Query. You can remove certain columns. You can deduplicate your data. You can add new columns and transform your data. All of the Power Query functionality in Power BI is identical to what it is in Excel. So if you're already familiar with that in Excel, you can access that here. If you're not, don't worry, we don't need to actually transform anything. We're just going to hit that green load button. Get that screen back up. Click on data. I'm going to hit load. So we're going to give that just a second to load. There we go. And you should get that little dialog box that says 10,000 rows were loaded. Now, while some of you might be working through that, I'll just make the point that if you come up here to get data again, say you're in a production environment and you've got data not in an Excel file. You've got a SQL Server, you're accessing via an ODBC, whatever. All of the most common data sources are available inside Power BI out of the box. And one of the more common ones that you're probably going to deal with are ODBCs. So if you come down here to more options and you just type in ODBC, there's your ODBC connector, and it's going to automatically pull up all of the machine ODBC sources that I have on this computer, and I can choose them here and pull data in that way. But all of the different things that you might want to connect to are contained here. All right. So once we get that data loaded, a couple things are going to change. On the report view page, you have these 3 tabs over on the right: data, visualizations, and filters. And if you hit this double arrow and open up your data tab, you should now see that there is one little row here labeled data, and it's got a caret. And if you hit that little caret, it will drop down and show you all of the different columns that are contained inside that table. And again, these are all the columns that we saw on the data load screen. We've got an address, city, date occurred, lat long, all of that stuff. Additionally, if you come over here to your table view over on the left, you can just look at that raw data just like you would inside Excel. So if you're just interested in seeing what the values are, or filtering down or sorting, you can do all of those same functions inside the table view. And then additionally, there is a model view. Now, model view becomes a lot more important when we're building dashboards off of more than one set of data. This is where we make all of the connections between data sets. But there are some things in here that we might want to know right away. The first is we might want to change the name of this table. So you'll see that right now we've just got one table of data. It's kind of floating in space. You can kind of click and drag it around. If you click on that, it's going to put this green border around the outside of the table. Additionally, it's going to bring up this properties window that you can open. And if you want to rename this, I'm going to rename it something that makes more sense other than data. I'm going to call this offenses. Come back. I accidentally loaded my table twice whenever I went through that little demo, so I'm going to delete that from the model. Okay. All right, so I'm going to come over here to properties. I'm going to rename this offenses. There we go. And I'm going to click off, and now my table is named offenses. And if you look over here in the data tab where your little caret is, now we've got a different name that makes a little bit more sense. The DAX view we're going to come back to a little bit later, but we're going to leave that for right now. Okay, so I'm going to head back to my report view, which is this icon in the top left. I've got my data tab open here. I can see that I've got one table of data and a couple of different columns that I can pull from. If you open up this visualizations pane, you're going to be doing a lot of going back and forth between this pane and the actual report to build out data-driven visualizations. But there are some very simple visual customizations that you might want to start off with before we actually start getting into the data. So there are a couple things that we can add. So for instance, if you were on the home page on the ribbon here, you can click on text box and we can just add a simple title to this dashboard. So I can come in here. This works just like it does inside Microsoft Word. I'm going to call this Journ Dashboard. I'm going to highlight it and I'll make that text bold, and maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger by just changing the font size here. You can also change your color. So I think I'll make this like a blue. It's supposed to be black. One of the things that is not super intuitive about this is how to move it around. So if you click on this and you go to drag it, that's how we're going to move all of our other visualizations around, but text boxes work a little bit differently. With the text box selected, and you know it's selected if it has these gray frame points on the corners and in the middle of the line, and you know it's not selected if those frame points don't show up. But with the text box selected, I'm going to click on these three dots in the bottom right, and I'm going to drag that over. I'm going to make sure that it's centered, and then I'm going to resize it so that we've got the title dead center at the very top. You've got some other visualization options that you can play around with this. I'm going to go into those a little bit later. Another thing that you can do that a lot of agencies really like is to add their own custom branding and their own imagery. And there's a couple different ways that you can do that. I'm actually going to show two different ways to add images to the dashboard. So the first one is if you come up to Insert and then go to Image. Inside that folder is a generic police badge image, just called badge. But if your agency has another image that you'd prefer to work with, by all means, pull in whatever you'd like. I'm going to double click on badge, and it's just going to add it as a widget to the dashboard. Now, annoyingly, you can just click on the center of this image and drag it around. You don't have to look for those three dots. The only time you have to look for those three dots is when you're dealing with a text box. So I'm going to click this guy and just move him to the top right corner and resize him so he's not quite as overstated. The other thing that we can do is add an image as a watermark. And I do not have the artistic mind to make this work really well, but I know a lot of different analysts do, so I always like to make sure to cover it. On your visualizations tab, we're going to make sure that we don't have either our text box or our image selected. So make sure that that frame is not around either one of our existing objects. So just click the background. I'm going to click on Format Your Report Page. And then I'm going to go to Canvas Background. And where it says Image here, you can click there and browse for your image. Now, this is really confusing because once it starts showing up here, you should be like seeing an image, right? By default, it sets the transparency to 100%. So your image is there, it's just transparent. So if you grab this and move this down, you can see that, okay, now my image is showing up sort of as a watermark in the background. You've got a couple of different fit options here you can sort of play around with. I always like to show this because there are people who do really cool things with background watermark images. I just not happen to be one of them. So before we move into data-driven stuff, I'm just going to change this transparency back to 100% and start from there. Any questions on the basics of the interface, ingesting data, or adding text or images before we move into some of the data-driven visualizations? Just check the chat real quick. And then, Geraldine, were you able to download those files? I'll optimistically interpret that silence as a yes. All right, there it is. Great. All right. Okay, so importantly, you'll notice that whenever you drop your caret down over here and it shows you certain columns, it's going to denote what type of data each one of these columns are. So we can see that date occurred. It's got a little calendar icon that's representing that as a date. Lat, log, and offense number. It's got a little sigma there. It's representing those as zones. And then everything else that doesn't have an icon is text. If you want to see what any one of these data types are, if you click on the column, it should automatically bring you to column tools over here on the left, and you should see that it's represent what data type it's representing each one of these columns as. We don't need to change any of these, but if we did, say it was interpreting date occurred as text instead of calendar, we could come in here and make a change. I do have a scenario a little bit later that we're going to run into where we do have to change those date types. But when you're building out dashboards for the first time in a production environment, you'll want to make sure that Power BI accurately recognizes each one of those data types. So the first visualization that I always start everybody with is a card. And a card are these little images over here on the left side that just display a count. Cards are very simple, but cards are very important. So if you study the design of dashboards, you'll see what's referred to as an F pattern quite a bit. And what that means is when we put Google glasses on people so that we can observe their eye movement as they look at a dashboard, what we'll start to see is a heat map where people's eyes tend to spend the most time in the top left corner of a dashboard. And then that fades out as they move to the right, and it fades out as they move down. So it's a very simple dashboard design theory is you place your most important piece of information that you want your consumer to know in the top left. And an easy way to do that is with a card. And then your least important stuff you put in the bottom right. So to create a card, we're going to open up our visualizations tab. And if your visualizations is closed, you just click these double arrows to open it up. And you're going to come down here to this little box with a 1, 2, 3 inside of it. And click, and it's going to add this nondescript gray box over here to the center of your dashboard. Now, one thing I want to warn you about, when you add a new visual, you have to make sure that you don't have any of your other existing visuals selected. So like, well, it's not going to work with anything that isn't data driven. But as we build this, as we build more and more visuals out, if I had a card that was already built out and then I decided that I want to put a bar graph in, if I've got this selected and I go choose bar graph, it's going to change and undo all of my work. It's one of the more annoying things about Power BI. I'll give you plenty of warnings about that as we move forward, but I just want to throw it out there up front. So I'm going to move this box to the top left. And over here under visualizations, under the visualization type, there's a field box. Now, the field box is going to change for every visualization that we go through. Cards are the simplest. They only require one field because they're just going to count some, provide a range, provide a first value, provide a last value. They're going to do some sort of aggregation on one field of data. So if you were to look at our offense data just in this tabular view, you can see typically the structure inside of police RMS is there's reports and then there's offenses. So every report can have multiple offenses involved in it. So if you look at this report number field and you sort it descending, you can see this report number 2024-999. That repeats twice. But if you look over here at the offense number, that does not. So this data set, every row represents an offense. Offenses can occur, there can be more of them in every report. That's why report numbers duplicate, but offense numbers don't. That's important because it's going to change how we might approach visualizing this card. So I'm going to go with offense number here, and I'm going to drag it into this field. And whenever you do that, it's going to automatically choose sum as an aggregation method. And you'll notice that it's displaying a count of 50 million, 50N. Well, that's wrong. There's not 50 million rows of data in this table. It's because instead of counting offense numbers, it's summing all of them together. So to change that, I'm just going to click on this field. Then you can see it's got sum checked here. I'm going to move this to a count. And now it's showing 10,000. That is the correct number. Now, if you go to count distinct, in this case, it's not actually going to change anything. And that is because in this particular set of data, every offense number can occur exactly one time. But if you were to put report number in there, that could have a real impact. So if I come over here to count, it's still showing 10,000. But if you come in here to count distinct, now it's showing fewer. That's because report number via values can duplicate. So I don't think, if you've never dealt with the back end of a relational database before, you've never run into that, I know that that can be really confusing and I don't want to belabor the point, but that is just something to be aware of. I don't necessarily know how you're going to be pulling your data, so just keep that in mind. So I'm going to put offense number in this field. I'm going to change it to a count. And it's showing us 10K. All right, so we've got officially our first data-driven visualization here, but you'll notice that it is ugly as sin. So we want to make this a little more attractive. And when I first started out building dashboards with classes, I spent a lot of time talking about the visualization of the very first card that we make. And the reason I do that, it might seem a little tedious, but it's because the minute you get all of your visualization settings on this card set, as we move forward and we build more sophisticated things, you can, with one button click, import all of those settings to your next visualization. So it makes sense to spend some time on this first visual to make sure that we get it right. So I'm going to make sure that I've got the visual selected, meaning that I've got these gray framing points around it. And then I'm going to come over here to my visualization tab, and I'm going to go to format your visual. And we're going to walk through some of the different options that we have, starting with call out value. So again, I'm on format your visual under the visual settings. If you hit this call out value drop down, this is going to bring you into a very Microsoft Word type interface here that should look very familiar. The first thing I'm actually going to change is the display units. I don't like that it's 10.00K. And that's happening because the display units by default is on this auto. If you change it to none, it just displays a number. That's a little bit better. You can do things like put it into thousands or millions or whatever in our data. None of that's really going to make sense. I'm just going to change it to none. You can also come in here and change the font. So I changed my text up here to be this dark blue, and you'll notice that it should have made that dark blue in one of my recent colors, but it didn't, so I'm just going to pull that out from the column here. I'm going to make it bold so it stands out. I'm going to pick my font size, whatever you want to do. You can also mess with the category label. So if you come down below call out value, the category label is this text here that says count of offense number. Now, if you want to, you can change this and you can do whatever you want to it. You can make it underlined, italics. You can change the color, make it orange. In most of my dashboards, I just turn it off. And the reason I turn it off is because I'm going to add a title to the top of this, and then the category label is going to become redundant. So I'm going to toggle mine off. Again, as we work through these, you guys follow your bliss. I'm certainly not an artist design expert. So if you want to keep that label on and play with the settings, you can. If you come over here to general, we're not going to mess with the properties very much because this is where you can come in here and manually change things like height. All of this stuff under properties, we adjust whenever you click and drag it around or just drag the border of the card around. So you don't necessarily need to come in here and play with properties very much. I will turn the title on. And whenever you turn the title on, the first thing you're going to need to do is give it a title, and you type the title into your text. So I'm going to call this a total offense count. And you can see it's added text to the top of my card. Now you can mess with some of the preset headings if you want. I don't really see a big difference between most of them. You can also come in here and change your font. So maybe I'll mess with this guy. Yeah, I'll change Sego UI bold. Why not? One of the things that I like to do with my cards especially is to make the text color white and the background color something dark. I think that just makes them stand out a little bit more. But again, welcome to do whatever you like here. And then I'm going to change my alignment to be horizontal. So I'm going to click off of this, and that's going to collapse this visualization menu for a second, just so I can kind of get a look at how my card is looking. And it's looking a little bit more attractive. I'm going to click back on. And I'm going to go back to format your visual and general, and I'm going to keep working through some of these options. So there is an effects section here. I don't mess around with a whole lot of these normally, but you can come in here and like change the background if you want and make the background of your cards, whatever color you'd like. I'm going to keep mine white. You can also mess with the transparency of your background. One of the things that I do really like to do is a visual border. So I'm going to turn my visual border to on. And I'll typically put the same color as whatever color my title background is. So I'm choosing this really dark blue. So I'll choose that color there. I almost 100% of the reason why I turn visual border on is so that I can round the corners. And I cannot explain this. There's nothing logical about it. But for some reason, a card with rounded corners just looks more attractive. So here's what it looks like right now with square corners. But I'm going to come back over here to my general section and effects, visual border. And then I'm going to give those like a 10-point rounded corner. That to me just looks way more pleasant. I don't really understand why, but I always round my corners. Back to effects. You can also make the width of that visual border a little bit thicker if you like. You can turn on a shadow. I don't particularly care for shadows because I think they just take up unnecessary space, but you can see with the shadow turned on now, it looks like there's a light source hitting it sort of from the top left and the shadow is all in the bottom right. But you can play around with the different offsets of how that shadow looks. You can put the shadow on the inside as opposed to the outside. You can change the direction that the light is coming from. So right now the shadow is going off to the bottom right. If you want it to be off to the bottom left, you've got pretty granular ability to edit your shadows, but I'm just going to leave that off. And then you do have some other options down here like data format. You can make this force it to keep your comma there. So yeah, if you come into format options and you go to whole number and turn your thousands separator on, it will turn that comma on. Spreadsheet people like me tend to get like really upset if we can't put our comma in our thousand space. You've got a couple of different things you can play with here. Like if we were using decimals, you could change with your decimal spaces, but this should always be a whole number. So we're not going to mess with that too much. And then some of this other stuff we're going to get into a little bit later, especially the tooltip option. So, but for right now, we're going to leave that off. So once we're done, we should have a pretty attractive looking card here. Oh, there's one more option that I wanted to go over. If you go back to your title, so I am under the format your visual, general, and title section. You can turn on a subtitle, and we're actually going to do that with our third card, but not our first. You can also turn on a divider. And a divider is a colored bar in between the title and the rest of your card. If you've got an agency that's got two color schemes, this is a really great way of putting second color in the mix. So let's just say that we want to do like that really deep blue and a second really deep red. Maybe I'll do a bright red. I can put a little red divider in there, and now I've got a second color in my color scheme. You can change that to be dashed or dotted. I think those look weird. Keep mine solid. So right now, all we've got is a dashboard that displays our total offense count. Was everybody able to follow along with the visualizations, and is everybody's card displaying 10,000? If you are, all right, so there are a couple questions here. The watermark transfer, I believe images will transfer. So the way that we put them in here, where it's like its own little widget on the backboard, will transfer. I don't believe watermark will, but let me test that out and I'll get back to you. And then for those of you who are seeing slightly different options, if you look down here where it says page 1, and you'll notice that I've got a little green square with a white plus sign inside of it for adding a new page. If you are seeing yellow there, that means that you've got the enterprise version of Power BI, not the desktop version, which is okay. You're going to be able to follow along. It's going to look 90% similar to what you're seeing when you follow along with me. But there are going to be some places where I've got some additional options that you don't have. So I apologize for that, but that's probably what you're seeing. For whoever asked that question, is that what you're seeing? Do you see yellow around your plus sign here? That's not it. I don't have data format option. I see it. That's the header. If you click on your card, okay, so you're saying that you don't see data format here underneath effects. Okay. Can you guys go to your file button and then down to about, and then look at your version here. So are all of you seeing November 2024 or later there? Or are you seeing something that might be a little bit earlier? August 2024. So that might be your issue. So one of the really cool things about Power BI is that it is incredibly dynamic. Microsoft updates it faster than anything else I've ever seen Microsoft update, and they're constantly pushing changes and new stuff. One of the downsides of Power BI is that Microsoft is constantly changing it and pushing new stuff. So if you're not seeing that option there, I think that that might have been something that they added somewhat recently. I think that that might be it. If you are able to update Power BI and you're still not seeing that option, shoot me an email and we'll work through it together. But you should be able to do everything that we just did with the exception of adding that comma there. All right. So I'm going to keep going, but by all means, if you update and you're still seeing those issues, follow up with me. I'll walk you through it and we'll try to figure out how to get you those options back. So you should now have a card in your top left that's formatted the way you want. I am going to simply copy and paste that card and make our second card. So to do that, I'm just going to select it. I'm going to hit Control C and then Control V to bring in a second card. Now this card is going to be a little different. And if you look at our template, this is counting part one offenses. So part one offenses, that's a old UCR term. It's rape, robbery, homicide, auto theft, larceny, burglary, and arson, I believe. So structurally speaking, this is the same thing, except that this card up here in the top left is counting all of our rows, but we only want this card to count certain rows. So we don't have to come in here and remake the card again. It's already feeding off of the offense number column. It's already got all of our visualization options the way we want it to. What we have to do at this point is simply add a filter. So to do that, we're going to open up our filter tab here. And there's actually a bunch of different types of filters. We're going to explore them all one by one. But this is a real simple version of a filter. And that is we're filtering on our offense type. And offense type is contained inside the neighbors code column. So to use that as a filter, I'm simply going to click and drag neighbors code into where it says filters on this visual, add data filters here. So you'll notice that there is the ability to add filters on a particular visual, which is what we're doing. You can also add them to an entire page. You can also add them to all pages in our workbook. The process is the same. It's just a matter of where you drag that field to. Additionally, once you open up this filter, there's a couple different types of filtering. So we're going to start with a basic filter. We are also going to do an advanced filter and a top-end filter. So this is showing all of this little basic filtering window here. This almost works like a pivot table inside Excel. It's showing you every unique value that occurs inside this column and then how many times it occurs over here on the right. So in order to get this right, to make sure that it's only showing part one offenses, you have to know what the part one offense codes are, which you can look up. But off the top of my head, that should be 09A is homicide. So I'm going to select 09A. I believe 11A are your sex offenses, 120 is your robberies, 13A is your ag assaults, 220 are your burglaries, larcenies are 23A through H. I think auto theft is 240. I might be getting some of these a little wrong, but it doesn't really matter. So you come through here and you select which values you want this card to count. And so now I'm going to collapse this. You can see that we're displaying a much smaller number up here. That makes sense. We're only showing Part 1 offenses. But we've got to change up this title because we're no longer counting total offenses, we're just counting Part 1s. So to do that, I'm going to make sure I've got this card selected. I'm going to go back over here to my Visualizations tab. I'm going to go to Format Your Visual, General, and Title. And I'm going to change this from Total to Part 1. There we go. Was everybody able to add a filter? Just for anybody who might be struggling, I'm going to run through that one more time really quickly. So we've copy and pasted this card. I'm going to open up the Filters tab. I'm going to grab the NIBRS code column and bring it over to here where it says Add Data Filters here. And then I'm just going to select the values that I want. 09A, 11A, 120, 13A, 220, and then most of the 23s, and then 240. If you selected some different values, don't worry, no test on this. And then I'm going to close that, and we should have our second card. So our third card that we want to walk through is a little bit different. This is Part 1 offenses in the last 28 days. So in order to do this, we're going to have to add not only a Part 1 offense filter, but also a relative date filter, one that only looks at the previous 28 days. And then you'll notice the visualization for this is also a little bit different because it has a subtitle. So we'll need to add that as well. So to do that, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to copy and paste our second card. When I do that, if you open up the filters pane, you can see that our NIBRS code filter is still there from where we made it on the second card, which is great. So now we just need to add in our relative date filter. So to do that, we can grab our date occurred column and drag it below the NIBRS code where it says add data fields here. Now, before, when we were looking at a field that was just text with NIBRS codes in it, basic filtering was fine because we could just go through and just give it the handful of values that we wanted to count. With dates, you can do that, but it's going to be super impractical because every date time combination is going to be its own value. So we're going to change this to a relative date. And so this is where we get to tell it we want to see stuff in the last 28 days, in the last 90 days, whatever. So I'm going to choose is in the last, and then I'm going to click on this middle row here. I'm going to type in 28 days, and I'm going to hit apply filter. And this should filter your number down to, oh, mine's 31. If yours is a little bit different, that's fine. But yours should definitely be significantly different from what was up here in Part 1 offenses, which should be significantly less than what was up here in total offense count. Was everybody able to add those filters and get those 3 cards made? Not seeing anybody throwing up a panic sign, so I'm going to keep on trucking. All right, so at this point, we've got 3 visualizations, but they're fairly static. And I like to get a slicer onto the screen as fast as I possibly can so that we can test the interactive nature of these visualizations. So to get started with the slicer, I'm going to go back over to my visualizations box. And then there is an icon here that's got a table with a little filter in the bottom right. If you hover over it, it displays the word slicer. And I'm going to click on that. Now, earlier I warned you to make sure that whenever you go and you add a new visualization that you don't have a previous visualization selected. So let me show you what happens if you do that. If you've got your card selected over here, and then I come over here and I pick slicer, it's going to now change this. This doesn't really look recognizable to me anymore. It's going to try to shove all of my card settings into a slicer, and that's not what I want. You can always hit undo. And make sure that you click on the background first to make sure that you don't have any of these guys selected, and then hit your slicer guy. And that's going to bring another nondescript gray box up that we're going to need to make pretty. So one of the most common fields that people will want to slice on is date, to make a custom date range. And you'll notice that over here in our field section, again, our visualization is just asking for one field. So I'm going to go grab my date occurred field and I'm going to drag it in. Now, by default, it should give you this little interface where you can come in here and you can type in a date. You can also manually select dates. It's also going to automatically find the oldest and the latest dates in the date range and put those in these boxes. So our data runs from September of 2021 all the way through December of 2026. Now, I added future data because I don't want to be updating this data all the time every time I do one of these classes, right? But this is actually a problem that you're going to run into in most police departments. Typically, everybody's got a couple case reports that somebody meant to type in 2024 and they accidentally typed in 2034. Or, you know, they meant to type in 2021 and they typed in 1981 because they had a brain failure. So we are going to deal with this and make it so that the upper boundary is always today. But first, we have to make this fit the theme, the visual theme that we spent so much time building out whenever we built those cards, right? So to do that, I'm going to click off of my slicer and I'm going to click on one of the cards. I'm going to make sure I've got the home tab selected up here in the ribbon. And there's an option just here in the top left called Format Painter. If you click on Format Painter, it will change your cursor to this little paintbrush. You can then drag that over here to your visualization and click on it, and it will add all of your settings to this card. Now, it's not showing a title because it won't take the text from a title and put it in here. But if you come over here to Format Your Visual, and then go to General and Title, you can type in something there in the text and the whole format will pop out and you'll see you've got your text color, your background color, you've got that border in between the header and the rest of the card. And then you've also got your visual border with the rounded corners as well. All of that's automatically brought over by the Format Painter. I'm going to resize this so it takes up as little space as possible. Bring it over here into the top right. Now, I do want to show some additional options. So the Format Painter is great, but every visualization type has slightly different options. So if you're format painting a card to a slicer or a slicer to a bar graph or something like that, chances are there are some things that you might have to still go through manually and clean up a little bit. So I'm going to go to Format Your Visual, and I'm just going to do a real quick review of slicer of different things that were not brought over by the Format Painter. So slicer settings, dates are going to be a between by default, but there are different options here. You can make a vertical list where every date, time becomes a different thing that you can select. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense for dates. Relative dates might be something that is useful. So instead of coming in here and picking a date range, I can come in here and I can say, I only want to see stuff in the last 28 days. And you'll see that all of these offense counts update. But for the most part, I like to leave this as a between. And then you do have some other things that you can mess with. You've got those same effects options here. If you want to play with those, you can. But the big thing that I want to do is I always want to make the last date in the date slicer today's date. And I can do that by adding a filter here. So I'm going to make sure that my date slicer is selected. And then I'm going to open up my filter window. I'm going to bring in date occurred. Whenever I do that, it's going to give me that basic filter again. I don't necessarily want to do that. I'm going to change this to a relative date. And then I'm going to change this to the last 9,999 days, maybe years. I just want to give it like a really long date range and hit apply filter. Now, when you do that, that's 3-ish years of data. No, that's 30-ish years of data. We don't have 30 years of data. So the back end of this is totally unaffected by this filter. The oldest data is not going to be filtered out by this. What's going to be filtered out is the stuff that occurred in the future, because a relative date starts from today and goes back a certain number of days. Now you'll notice that when I added the filter, your slicer, depending on what version you have, it may or may not have automatically updated this last date to be today. If yours didn't, like mine did, take your end date, drag it to the bottom, and then drag it back up. And it should refresh and just show today's date as the last selectable date. And now you can see that if we come around and we play with this, you can see those card numbers are changing, and we've got a dynamic dashboard now. Of course, because our third slicer is only showing stuff in the past 28 days, if you mess with the bottom range, that card is not going to change. But if you move things back past the previous 28 days, this is now going to show blank. And the reason being is because this is already filtered down to only show the last 28 days. I'm looking at this card and I'm realizing that we forgot to add a subtitle. So before we move on to text slicers, I'm just going to click on that card real quick. I'm going to go to Format Your Visual. I'm going to go down to General and Title. And then there's a subtitle option here. I'm going to turn that on. I'm just going to type in 28 days. If that text color that makes sense, then center it. Sorry about that. Sometimes I get excited and get ahead of myself. Was everybody able to get your date slicer formatted and in the right position with today's date as the last date? Anybody having any trouble with that? All right, I don't see anybody panicking, so I'm going to finish up these last couple minutes by just throwing in a text slicer. So another thing that you might want to slice on are text values. This is going to look a little bit different. So to get started, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to put a new slicer in. I'm going to start with a nondescript gray box. I'm going to look at my offense data. I'm going to find my officer column. And I'm going to drag that into the field. And you can see now we've got a table of different officer names. And if I click on one of these guys, now we're just seeing each officer's individual productivity over this date range. So we can see Officer Adams has done 16 Part 1 offenses and been the reporting officer on 77 total offenses. I'm going to format paint this. So I'm going to click on my date slicer. I'm going to go up to Format Painter and click on my slicer here. Then I'm going to go to Format Your Visual and General and Title. And we're going to give this a title. Reporting Officer. Now here, it's got this scrolling table. There are some options that you might want to be aware of when you're doing text-based slicers. So if we go back to Visual and Slicer Settings, if you want this to be a vertical list, you can. If you want it to be a tile, meaning that it's going to display kind of like a table and you can go in there and select names like that, can. This is a little impractical. What I really like with these are drop downs. And a drop down allows you to take up even less space. And you can hit that drop down menu and you can scroll through and pick a name. You've also got selection options here. So there might be times right now you can select multiple officers' names by holding the control button. So if I click on Adams, hold control and click on multiple names, it's now going to be cumulative counts over here on the left for all of these officers. If you want to force your users to only be able to select one name, you can click single select. And so now I can't do that. You have to select just one officer. You can also put in a select all option there as well at the top. That allows you to toggle just selecting everybody on and off. And then at any point, you can also come in here and run a search. So this option is not contained over here on the right under Build Your Visual. But if you have your slicer selected, so you've got your frame around it, if you click on these three dots over here and then click the search button, that will enable this little search box. So if you Instead of scrolling through and finding things manually, you want to be able to type in a name. It will automatically filter this table down. So I know that I just threw an absolute ton of information at you, but we've already made really good progress making some simple visualizations. When we get together next time, we're going to build some more sophisticated stuff, and we're going to talk about sharing and pushing stuff to the cloud, all of which Power BI makes super easy. And then we'll get into transforming and cleaning data with DAX, creating dynamic measures, and then also using Power Query and some of the more advanced features in January. So we are right at an hour. I hope everyone's enjoyed this. If you at some point fell behind and you're like, I just can't follow, and now I'm just like woefully lost, shoot me an email. I'll try to, get you caught back up so you can follow on with our next class. And of course, everybody should have access to the Canva presentation that should also have some walkthroughs of how we did this stuff. So if you're struggling, you can also refer to that. But if there aren't any questions, please fill the reporting requirements. And if there aren't any questions, then I will see you guys next week.
Thank you, Charlie. And just a reminder, please help us out and take the brief feedback survey. The link is in the chat there, and we will try to get the recording posted as soon as possible. If any of you would like to, be able to review that and go back through it. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to leave this open for a few more minutes so you can get that link. Please take the survey. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.